This video is about inspection by Wilfred Owen. I've highlighted the spec part of inspection in red here because it will remind you of the central image in this poem, the blood that the soldier has on his uniform. This is a deceptively simple poem. It's a conversation between an officer, his subordinate, the sergeant, both of whom are inspecting a parade of men, and they both have a conversation with a man they're inspecting. And this man has blood on his shirt and is therefore punished. This is a picture of General Field Marshal Haig here inspecting the troops, and it's a typical First World War scene, and I've put it in there so you can see what an inspection looks like. This man will be the sergeant who's accompanying his officer, making sure that the troops are immaculate on parade, and it's about army discipline. The first thing we have to realise is who's speaking. I rapped. This is the commanding officer. He may be a captain, maybe a colonel, a major, a general, or even a field marshal. His rank is unexplained, and so we might say that he represents officers in general. The first thing we'll notice is that this probably isn't an autobiographical poem. It's not Owen himself as the officer, although it could be. But what's interesting is that the officer is telling us this story as though it's a confession. He starts off attacking the soldier, but he will end as though in silent agreement with him. So it's quite a subtle journey that the poem takes us on. He begins very rudely. "You," he says. He clearly doesn't know the men under his command. This is relevant because he's going to be sending soldiers to fight, possibly for their lives, and has no real personal connection to them. This is emphasised again by the question, "What do you mean by this?" But before the soldier can reply, the officer fires a second question at him. In other words, he doesn't really care what the soldier thinks. Next, we notice the officer's language. He describes his speech as, "I rapped." You would rap someone on the knuckles, probably with a ruler when Owen was at school, and therefore this reminds us of punishment. And then he fires another question at him. "You dare come on parade like this?" And again does not wait for a reply. As soon as the soldier tries to reply here, he's cut off, represented by this dash. The soldier, in contrast, is incredibly polite. "Please, sir," he says, even though he's bleeding. The sergeant snapped, and in fact he rhymes with the officer, again showing how both of them are set firmly against the soldier. This perhaps suggests that the officer class are almost the enemies of the soldiers who serve under them. Next, Owen makes sure that the sergeant is uneducated in his language. "I takes 'is name, sir," the apostrophe here for the missing H, to show us that this man is probably not educated. And this is a way for Owen to suggest that the sergeant isn't really very intelligent or worthy of our respect. It is perhaps a snobbery that would have been quite common in 1914. Then there is a sense that the officer will not be polite to anyone below the rank of sergeant. "Please," he says to the sergeant, and that's the only sign of respect he has in this conversation. He then dismisses both the sergeant and the soldiers on parade. However, we're going to find that the officer then must go back, and this suggests that he thinks better of his actions. This is revealed here. "He told me afterwards." The officer has gone back to find out the soldier's point of view, or at least find out more about him. The punishment the soldier receives, a few days confined to camp, suggests that the officer himself has not put him on that charge, not given him that punishment. He's not able to go out on leave and socialise, be with his friends, drink, whatever it is that the soldiers do on leave. Instead, he's stuck at base. The officer then quotes the charge. He's dirty on parade, but the quotation marks suggest that perhaps the officer doesn't think this was appropriate, even though it's the punishment that he insisted on. Then Owen deliberately uses the language of Macbeth. The damned spot is what Macbeth's wife, Lady Macbeth, calls the blood on her hand after she and Macbeth have killed the king. And so it's a symbol of being unnatural, killing your king, going against God. And through this subtle use of language, which he would expect all his readers to recognise, he's suggesting that what the soldiers are doing at war is also against God and is also unnatural. Here the officer now adds the telling detail that the soldier has given him, that the blood on his uniform is actually his own blood. He's been injured in battle. Presumably this is his dress uniform, so once he's changed out of the uniform he fought in, he's still bleeding. It suggests that the injury might be potentially serious. The use of well here seems quite ironic. It suggests that the officer doesn't really care. However, another meaning for well is obviously a deep well that you draw water from, and it suggests that there's plenty more blood coming, as though the soldier is a well who's going to run dry. And if you're thinking about the A star, this conversation about blood reminds us of the well that Lady Macbeth and Macbeth stand by, trying to wash the blood from their hands after they've committed murder. Next, the soldier repeats the officer's words, blood's dirt, and then he laughs about it. This is a sign of disrespect, and the fact that the officer doesn't immediately punish him further for this disrespect suggests that actually the officer knows he's in the wrong, and he actually agrees with the soldier's views. The officer now puts himself into the mind of the soldier. He imagines when the soldier looks away what the soldier's thoughts must be, as though he's imagining the blood almost merged forever into clay. And this is an image of death. Man's body comes from clay, and it's a recurring idea in Wilfred Owen's poems. This is the story of Genesis in the Bible. It's what God made man from. He made him from earth. And the idea that the blood is merging once more with that clay suggests that man is becoming dead again. Next, we have some personification. So the world here is turning against mankind. That's its human action. And it's washing out its stains. And so this suggests that the soldier's blood is the stain on the world, or the soldiers themselves are the stains on the world. So the world is getting rid of soldiers by slaughtering them. It's as though the war is just there to rid the world of young men. The fact that the world hates young men is suggested by this further element of personification. The world doesn't like us. Who? Our cheeks so red, again suggesting youth, indeed very young men. And then he rams the point home. Young blood's its great objection. The world objects to the blood of the young, and that's why it's killing the young off. So we've had a strange turn here. It began as a poem that seemed to be attacking the officer class for not caring about the soldiers under their command and sending them to be injured or killed and not caring about them. But now the attack is much wider. It's against the world, and the world might represent politicians, it might represent kings and queens and the people in power, or it might actually be a personification of the earth, and he's imagining that the earth is somehow attacking mankind because mankind is objectionable. The idea that he's attacking all mankind rather than just the politicians in power is this: the race. The race will bear Field Marshal God's inspection. In other words, God is going to look at man and inspect him and find that he has been found wanting. This can only mean that he objects to man's nature as killers. The war is just revealing what men are really like, and the soldier is imagining that they must all be punished because they're all killers. This makes it quite a tragic poem. The soldier is imagining himself being dead, and all he's done is follow orders and fight for his country. But because being a soldier has made him a killer, he thinks that he's going to fail God's inspection and therefore go to hell. This must be a terrible insight for a Christian, to think that they began fighting a war that they thought was good, and then having fought it, realise that they've sacrificed their souls and they're actually going to go to hell because of their actions. But set against this is the idea that God is actually a field marshal, the idea that God is actually overseeing the war. This suggests that God is in favour of the fighting and obviously favours both sides. However, that would be ironic. The Germans would think that God was on their side and the British would think that God was on theirs, and actually that can't be possible. God can't be supporting both sides in the war, and it's that impossibility which leads the soldier to think actually we're all guilty and we're all going to be judged. And then we have this really prophetic line here, as though Owen is looking into the future. The soldier imagines when we're duly whitewashed. A whitewash implies a cover-up, and so he's imagining a time after the war, and the brutality of the war and the slaughter and the murder is all going to be hushed up. It will be whitewashed. People won't talk about it. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. That's an extraordinary insight to Wilfred Owen, who of course died in the last week of the war, and so he never knew how the war would be treated after it happened. It was called the War to End All Wars, the Great War, and it finished in 1919. Nevertheless, only 20 years later, the whole of Europe was at war again in 1939. And you might argue that we could only have started that war if the horrors of the First World War had been whitewashed. People hadn't allowed themselves to appreciate just how horrific it was. Okay, finally we need to consider the structure of the poem here, and it's quite interesting. You see that it's rhyming, alternate rhymes: away, clay, bled, said, then red breaks that pattern, dead rhymes back, an alternate line, and objection and inspection. So it's a mostly predictable rhyme, and then you look at the syllable pattern and realise that each line has got different number of syllables. There's no real pattern to it. Perhaps this makes it more like real speech, and so we can imagine this conversation actually happening. It makes it more realistic, and perhaps suggests that the soldier's objection to the race is a realistic one. This is what the whole human race is like, and it's an honest portrait. It's not an artificial poem that's a work of art. It's actually telling us the truth. And so we're left with an image which suggests that God is going to punish us all, and indeed he's right to do so. A very despairing poem.